This is TJR, and if you like these essay videos, please click like before the video is over and let the video play till the very end. This helps the YouTube algorithm recognize this channel and recommend these videos to more viewers. Thanks for your support. 43 years ago saw the premiere of Star Trek the Motion Picture, the first movie that began the Star Trek film franchise. And I remember going to the theater back in 1979 to see it. It was my last year of high school. And looking back at that time, I'm reminded of just how much times have changed. These days, Trek fan culture, geek fan culture is very loud and proud. But back in the 70s, when I went to high school, admitting to liking Star Trek was basically the equivalent of committing social leprosy. But that was then and this is now. And back then, I was already a really big fan of the TV show. My big sister had been the catalyst who introduced me to the series. And during that time, I watched all 3 seasons on TV. I watched the early mid-70s animated series, and I'd read a few of the earliest original Star Trek novels. But now, we had a big budget motion picture with the original cast intact and directed by Robert Wise, no less, a man who had directed cinema classics like West Side Story and The Sound of Music, and the seminal science fiction film The Day the Earth Stood Still. It was opening night, anticipations were high. I went with a group of high school friends who also liked Trek, and I can remember so much about that night. In fact, I remember one of my friends losing his ticket, and we took up a collection to buy him a replacement so he could go into the theater. And the girl who was at the ticket booth saw us doing this, and she felt bad for us. And so she just gave him the ticket and said he can go in. And that was really nice for us to remember that. So we watched the movie, and afterwards, I remember just being really blown away by how amazing the film looked. I mean, I'd never seen Star Trek look like this, and not even the recently released Star Wars from 2 years prior looked as good as this film did. But after opening week, there was a general feeling of disappointment with everyone that I talked to about the film. And this was mirrored by the fan press reaction as well. Remember, this was in the 70s. This was long before the internet allowed for instant fan reaction to be available. Reaction to this film was so poor in general that in time, Star Trek the Motion Picture would oftentimes sourly be referred to as Star Trek the Motionless Picture. Over the years, the film would be considered to be kind of a dud, a missed opportunity. But in spite of all the negative reaction, I have to admit that I still had a fondness for it. During its initial run, I went back to the theater a couple more times to see it before it left theaters. And later, when VHS became a thing, I watched it quite a number of times after that. And in time, I did understand the negative critical reaction that this film received, and yet there was still something very undeniably fascinating about it for me. I couldn't put my finger on it for years until one day, my big sister's husband, the same big sister who introduced me to the series, described my experience when he said, "There's a great movie inside that is screaming to get out." This statement became completely clear in 1983 when ABC TV gave the movie its broadcast premiere. 12 minutes were added to the film, and I remember a lot of very sarcastic fan reaction to this announcement. The movie's too long already. Do they really think that making it longer is going to make it better? Now, it was true that some of the added footage was unnecessary, and one bit of added footage resulted in one of the biggest broadcast TV bloopers ever, as it included a scene with unfinished special effects. But there was one scene that startled me and other Trek fans who watched it that night. A scene that was, quite frankly, a revelation. A scene that proved just how poorly the motion picture was edited because it changed how you perceived the entire movie. This scene took place after Spock's mind meld journey with V'ger. After being rescued by Kirk, Spock wakes up in the sick bay and he's laughing. And he explains to Kirk and McCoy just who and what V'ger is. He explains how this machine has amassed a universe of knowledge, but it still can't understand simple human feeling. And now it is asking, is this all I am? Is there nothing more? Later, on board the bridge, as V'ger is threatening the existence of the Earth, Kirk discovers Spock at his station, crying. Yeah, Spock is crying.
I weep for V'ger as I would for a brother.
Now, in the original TV series, if Spock were to cry or show human emotions, it was because he was under some kind of alien influence. But this time, it was just Spock crying on his own accord. And in this scene, Spock explains to Kirk that V'ger is how he once was, without feeling, without hope. And in this one scene, Spock as a character is deconstructed. And how I previously viewed him was now changed. Throughout the entire TV series, Spock was always portrayed as trying to submerge his human half. And while it was never openly stated, it was clear now that he was in denial of it, and perhaps even ashamed of it. Now, prior to this scene, the motion picture seemed to lack a central character focus and character story arc. But now it was clear. The movie was not about Kirk regaining command of the Enterprise or V'ger evolving into some higher form of life. It was about Spock coming to terms with his humanity and accepting his human half. And this is why he gives Kirk a birthday gift in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. It's completely illogical for a Vulcan to do this, but it makes perfect sense if you're a human.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Message, Spock?
None that I'm conscious of. Except, of course, happy birthday.
Such a critical scene. And yet it was cut out. How could this have happened? Once again, this was the pre-internet age, so information like this was slow and hard to come by. But in time, I would learn that Star Trek: The Motion Picture had never, ever received a proper editing, and that the film's crew had to race against a contractually obligated premiere date of December 6, 1979. In later interviews, director Robert Wise would go on the record to state that he considered the version of the film that was released in theaters to be only a rough cut and nothing more. And while this expanded TV version was in no way a director's cut, it was an indication of just how much the film needed and deserved a proper edit. Prior to the era of home computers and even the era of DVDs, I considered the possibility of actually obtaining 2 VHS machines and attempting my own edit of the film using both the theatrical and the TV version, both of which were available on VHS at that time. Then, ironically enough, in the year 2001, and why that's ironic, you'll find out in a moment, but in that year, we saw the release of the director's edition of Star Trek: The Motion Picture to DVD, and my wish had been granted. Yes, the crying sequence was in the director's cut, of course, but there were other alterations as well. Many originally intended pre-production special effects were completed for this version and helped add a lot more gravitas and weight to the film. A good example is when V'ger launches the orbiting explosives around Earth, all we see is a little view screen display on the Enterprise that's not even photographic, it's just illustrative, that shows little lights circling around the Earth. In this newer version, we actually see V'ger launching these probes, these missile probes, out at Earth in space, and we see them circling the Earth, and it carries so much more a sense of threat and menace and really gives you a sense of the stakes when you actually see it. In addition, scenes and parts of scenes were in some cases cut and in other cases extended. Also, a lot of the film's more ponderous scenes, such as when they're traveling through V'ger and you just see all these reaction shots, many of these scenes received trimmings as well. But what about that boring, let's look at the ship for 10 minutes scene? Now, if you've never seen the film, the sequence that I'm referring to occurs early during the film's first act. The setup is that it's been ages since Kirk has seen the Enterprise, a ship that has played a huge role in defining both who he is professionally and personally. So upon arrival to an orbiting Starfleet space station, Scotty takes Kirk on a complete 360-degree flying tour of the Enterprise. It's 5 minutes long, and it has been a bone of contention for both fans and critics as to how slow and boring this film is. And it's usually the first thing that I hear people cite whenever anyone wants to criticize this film as a failure. Back then, I may have been one of the film's few supporters, but even I thought that that scene needed a little bit of trimming. Well, I'm happy to say that Robert Wise chose to leave the entire scene completely intact. And in his commentary for the director's edition, he addresses this choice, explaining that after years of only being able to see the Enterprise on the small TV screen and realized with very limited special effects, and also don't forget just how much smaller TVs were back in the 70s, that he and Gene Roddenberry wanted to finally give audiences a scene that would not only give us a sense of the true scale of the USS Enterprise, but also a scene that would portray its grace and its beauty in a way that the original TV series never could. And then adding besides, Jerry Goldsmith's score was beautiful, and it fit the scene perfectly. At this point, I can't help but be reminded of J.J. Abrams, prior to the release of his reboot of Star Trek in 2009, talking to the press and saying, I really want to give viewers a sense of scale. And as he talked about that, I kept thinking, yeah, that was done back in 1979. Quite frankly, I had always found this scene to be very reminiscent of the long docking sequence in the Stanley Kubrick film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Yes, these scenes do slow the film down to glacier-like speed, but they are also beautiful to look at as well. They are visuals set to music. They are art for art's sake. It's something that you look at while you listen to the music. Now, at this time, I think it's important to explain the obvious and enormous influence that 2001: A Space Odyssey had on the making of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. In my lifetime, I have listened to interviews with Apollo astronauts who have always referenced Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey as the film that came closest to portraying what space travel is actually like. I also remember an interview with Gene Roddenberry recounting a chance encounter with an Apollo astronaut who expressed this very same sentiment to him. I think this conversation is one of the main reasons why the influence of Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece is all over Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Star Trek: The Motion Picture is the most grounded film representation of space travel since 2001: A Space Odyssey. Comparing the very bright Technicolor look of the Enterprise on the TV show to the more gray metallic version in this film, I can understand why there were a lot of fans who said this wasn't the Star Trek they grew up with. And definitely, this is a more grounded version of the Enterprise and a more grounded version of Star Trek. Also, I should add, the feeling of loneliness and alienation that was very present during the spaceflight to Jupiter in 2001 is also present in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which I think also added to the distaste that fans felt for this film because the original Star Trek was nothing like that. But I think it works fine here because in this film, Both Kirk and Spock are lost souls when this film begins, only to find themselves by film's end. In the wake of Star Wars, it would have been terribly easy for Star Trek the Motion Picture to just give us an action-packed screen spectacle in the same vein as Star Wars. A war with the Klingons would have been a great example. But instead, Star Trek the Motion Picture was willing to go the riskier route and give us a slower, more cerebral journey. Star Trek the Motion Picture wants to go beyond its TV roots. It wants to be an experience as well. Does it succeed? Overall, the director's cut, or director's edition as it's now being referred to, is a huge improvement. But I know that for some, this improved version will still be too slow. And I say this because they are usually the same people who say the same thing about 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's too slow. But at the end of the day, this is mostly just a matter of subjective tastes. Sadly, after the release of the director's edition DVD, it went out of print, and all subsequent re-releases of Star Trek the Motion Picture to DVD and to Blu-ray were the original theatrical cut. I honestly don't know why Paramount did this. Here we had all this effort and costs to finally make this film whole, and then they didn't include it in any subsequent re-releases. As a result, it's made recommending the director's edition to naysayers kind of a waste of time. But now, the director's edition has been given a 4K makeover. It's available for streaming on Paramount Plus, and as of the making of this video, it will be released on Blu-ray very soon. So if you dismissed this film a long time ago and the theatrical cut was the only version you ever saw, I would recommend that you give the director's edition a chance. Now is the time to watch it again and see it the way it was meant to be seen. This is TJR. Have you seen the director's edition? Are you going to see it? And if you have, what are your thoughts in comparison to the theatrical version? Did it change how you feel about the film, or do you still think it's too slow? Let me know your thoughts. I'll look forward to reading them in the comments. As always, if you like what I do here, be sure to click like, click subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you never miss a video. I also want to thank my patron supporters who are helping me to make more videos more often. Patron supporters receive early access to select videos and get exclusive videos available nowhere else. If you'd like to be a patron supporter, please go to patreon.com/TJR, the original, and make a monthly pledge. And if you can't, that's okay. Just click like. That'll help a great deal. Everybody, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.